Hello, students. This is Akshay Sir from the Divine School of Economics. I hope I'm audible to everyone who is attending this online lesson. In this lesson, we are going to continue with our discussion of the concept of monetary policy, which we cover within the Cambridge A-level economics course. This is specifically a part of the AS economics course. Okay, we have been discussing about the tools of monetary policy in the previous lessons. We had looked at the tools used by the central banks to control the money supply. Okay, now in this online lesson, I'm going to focus on the impact of expansionary as well as contractionary monetary policy on the economy using the ADAS graph. Now, we have talked about the aggregate demand curve, we have talked about the short run aggregate supply curve, we have also talked about the long run aggregate supply and how it is different from the short run aggregate supply. Now, in this lesson, we are going to learn how expansionary and contractionary monetary policy. I have discussed about both these terms in the previous lecture video. In this lesson, I'm going to look at how expansionary and contractionary monetary policy have an impact on the economy using the ADAS graph. It is going to be a very important lesson. Requesting all the students who are watching this online lesson, please make notes. Remember, the notes I'm making you write are absolutely sufficient. You don't need to refer to any other book. If you're doing these notes properly, they are sufficient in helping you with your MCQ paper also, as well as your data response and essay based paper also. Okay, so let's quickly start with our discussion of monetary policy and its impact on the economy in this online lesson. So I'm just writing the main heading just for the sake of clarity. This is Cambridge International Education 9708 is the course code. We are still on the discussion of the AS topics for the A levels. And we are still exploring the concept of monetary policy. We have learned from the previous lessons that monetary policy is often used by central banks to control the money supply. The central banks use interest rates as one of the primary instruments for controlling the money supply. Okay. And in case of an expansionary monetary policy, the central bank's objective is to increase the supply of money in the economy. Whereas a contractionary monetary policy is completely the opposite, where the objective of the central bank is to reduce the money supply in the economy. Okay. Now let's talk about impact of expansionary monetary policy. I can write effect of expansionary monetary policy. Effect of an expansionary monetary policy on the ADAS diagram. Okay, so let's look at the graph. Let me draw a graph first. On the horizontal axis, we are measuring the real GDP. On the vertical axis, we are measuring the price level. Okay, we all know that our aggregate supply curve, our long run aggregate supply curve looks like this. It is horizontal first, indicating spare capacity available in the economy. Then it's upward sloping, and finally it becomes vertical when the resources are fully employed. I have discussed about the shape of the long run aggregate supply curve in my previous lessons. Okay, our aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. This is our AD curve, our initial aggregate demand. Initially, the price in the economy, let's say, is P1 and the real GDP is Y. Okay, real GDP talks about the output produced in the economy, which is measured at the base year prices, not the current year prices. Okay, now we all know that when you are on the horizontal portion of the long run aggregate supply, there is spare capacity available in the economy. That means your resources are still not fully utilized. Spare capacity is there in the economy. You still have resources to meet demand. Now, And expansionary monetary policy, we all know, directly impacts the aggregate demand. Let's say the central banks cut the interest rates. When interest rates fall, spending goes up, investment goes up. As a result, aggregate demand goes up, because students can recall that aggregate demand includes consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Okay, so if I talk about the fact that currently we are on the spare capacity portion, I can write an explanation that if there is spare capacity in the economy, if there is spare capacity in the economy, an expansionary monetary policy, one way in which the central banks conduct an expansionary monetary policy is by lowering the interest rates. An expansionary monetary policy may result in, it may result in higher national income. An expansionary monetary policy may result in higher national income. A cut in the interest rates, a cut in the interest rates, or an increase in the money supply through open market operations. We have done the tools of monetary policy. One is the interest rate, then we have open market operations, then we have reserve ratios, and so on. In case of open market operations, what does the central bank do to increase money supply? The central bank buys government bonds in exchange for printing currency, which gets circulated in the economy, thus causing the money supply to rise, right? So, a cut in the interest rates or an increase in the money supply may encourage more consumer expenditure and investment. May encourage more consumer expenditure. Consumer expenditure is captured by C, and investment, which is captured by I. This increases the aggregate demand. This increases the aggregate demand, which causes the AD curve to shift to the right, which causes the AD curve to shift to the right to AD1. As I can draw this in the graph also, students can see the graph. The aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right now because of an expansionary monetary policy. This expansionary monetary policy can be conducted either through a fall in the interest rates. When interest rates fall, borrowing becomes cheaper. Households can borrow for consumption purposes, firms can borrow for investment purposes. When interest rates fall, both C and I go up, aggregate demand goes up. When central banks directly increase the money supply through open market operations, that again leads to more money being circulated in the economy, which in turn again causes the aggregate demand to rise. So both a cut in the interest rates as well as an increase in the money supply serve as a part of an expansionary monetary policy. As a result, the AD curve shifts to the right because consumption and investment are both components of aggregate demand. Now, students can clearly see in the graph when aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, it causes an increase in the price level as well as the increase in the real GDP. Remember, at the same price, there is excess aggregate demand. At the price P1, at the price initial price P, when aggregate demand goes up, it drives or it puts pressure on the prices to rise. When prices rise, because firms had spare capacity, they increase the supply as well, thus causing the economy to reach a new higher level of real GDP Y1. Okay, so hoping students have understood this. I can further write that higher output. So I can first write that the higher aggregate demand, I can write that the higher aggregate demand can increase the real output. The higher aggregate demand can increase the real output from Y to Y1. Also, higher output will lead to an increase in employment as well. When firms decide to produce more output, they will hire more workers. So higher output is likely to result in an increase in employment. It is likely to result in an increase in employment. Okay, so what we learn is that if the economy has spare capacity, expansionary monetary policy can cause an increase in both the price as well as the output level. So I can conclude here. What we learn is if the economy has spare capacity, if the economy has spare capacity, an expansionary monetary policy, an expansionary monetary policy will result in both an increase in the price level as well as an increase in the real output. Okay, so this was one of the case when spare capacity was available. So I can write this was case 1 when there is spare capacity. Suppose there is no spare capacity. That means suppose you are on the vertical portion of the LRAS. So let's look at case 2. When there is no spare capacity. When there is no spare capacity in the economy. That means all the resources are fully employed to their best possible potential. The graph is going to look like this. Again, real GDP measured on the horizontal axis, price level measured on the vertical axis. This is our long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, now the aggregate demand curve is cutting almost on the vertical portion. So our aggregate demand curve, initial aggregate demand curve is, let's say, cutting here. Let's say this is our initial price level and initial equilibrium real GDP. So let's say this is Y1 and this is P1. Now a further increase in aggregate demand because of an expansionary policy will hardly, expansionary monetary policy will hardly have any effect. Let me show how this will happen. So students can see that now an expansionary monetary policy will shift the AD curve again from AD to AD2. Let's say this was AD1. You can clearly see that since we are now on the vertical portion, there is hardly a change in the output. Only the price level increases from P1 to P2. There is only an increase in the price from the initial price P1 to the new price P2. I can draw this more clearly. My long run aggregate supply curve is vertical here. So it's like this. This is my long run aggregate supply. So what we learn is that when there is no spare capacity, when there is no spare capacity in the economy, an expansionary monetary policy An expansionary monetary policy will only lead to an increase in the price level. Will only lead to an increase in the price level from P1 to P2 without any change in the real GDP. Without any change in the real GDP. Okay, so I hope all students are clear with this. Now, if I talk about contractionary, we have talked about expansionary monetary policy impact. Let's talk about contractionary monetary policy. So if students have understood expansionary, contractionary is very easy. It's just the opposite. Central banks can either increase the interest rates to conduct a contractionary monetary policy or directly reduce the money supply through open market sale of bonds. We have covered all this in the previous lessons as well. Effect of contractionary monetary policy on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Again, within this case one, when there is spare capacity in the economy, when there is spare capacity in the economy. Okay, let's look at the graph, how it's going to look like. So again, we have real GDP measured on the horizontal axis. We have price level measured on the vertical axis. Okay, our initial long run aggregate supply curve is again like this. And because the economy has spare capacity, let's say you are on this portion of the aggregate of the long run aggregate supply curve. This is the initial aggregate demand. And now a contractionary monetary policy means the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. From AD to AD1, the real GDP falls from Y to Y1. Okay, we know that contractionary monetary policy can either be because of an increase in interest rates or by directly reducing the money supply. So I can write that if there is spare capacity, if there is spare capacity in the economy, a contractionary monetary policy, through an increase in interest rates, or a fall in the money supply, would reduce consumption and investment, thus reducing the aggregate demand, causing the AD curve to shift to AD1. As a result, there is a fall in the price level as well as the real output in the economy. Students can clearly see this, that the real GDP or the real output level also falls. In fact, even the prices are like falling in this case. From P to P1, there's a fall in the price also in this particular graph. However, if there is no spare capacity and there's a contractionary monetary policy, what will happen? I can write when there is no spare capacity. That means when all the resources are fully utilized, when you are on the vertical portion of the LRAS curve. Remember, spare capacity is all to do with on at what position you are on the long run aggregate supply. If you are on the horizontal portion of the LRAS, that means there is spare capacity. If you are on the vertical portion, it means there is no spare capacity. So when I say that there is no spare capacity, it means we are on the vertical portion of the long run aggregate supply. So this is how our long run aggregate supply curve looks like. Okay, this is our LRAS, and our initial aggregate demand curve is, let's say, somewhere here. This is our AD curve, initial aggregate demand curve. This is our initial price level and the initial real GDP. When there's a contractionary monetary policy, it causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. You can clearly see that it only leads to a fall in the price level now, because you are anyways on the vertical portion of the LRAS where all your resources are anyways fully utilized. Okay, so it only causes the price to fall. So I can say that in this case, a contractionary monetary policy, only causes the price to fall. It only causes the price to fall from P1 to P2. There is no change in the real GDP. There is no change. Let me write this clearly. There is no change. There is no change in the real GDP. That means the real GDP will change only when there is spare capacity or idle resources lying in the economy. When there is no spare capacity, only prices change because of expansionary or contractionary monetary policy. Okay, the real GDP does not change when there is no spare capacity. Okay, so I hope students have understood this lesson on the impact of expansionary and contractionary monetary policy. Okay, if I sum up quickly, expansionary monetary policy will cause both the real output, it will cause the real output to rise and prices to rise when there is spare capacity. When there is spare capacity, okay, and it will only cause the prices to rise when there is no spare capacity. When there is no spare capacity. On the other hand, contractionary monetary policy, a contractionary monetary policy will cause real output and prices both to fall. Real output and prices both to fall when there is spare capacity. When there is spare capacity, but it will only cause prices to fall. It will only cause prices to fall when there is no spare capacity. That means when you are on the vertical portion of the LRAS. So this is what we learn from the impact of expansionary and contractionary monetary policy. I stop in this lesson. In the next lesson, we are going to look at, in the next online lesson, we look at the effectiveness of monetary policy. We also look at and evaluate the limitations. What are the limitations of monetary policy in the economy? Okay, so I stop in this lesson. I hope students have enjoyed this lesson. Any doubts? You can unmute your mics and ask. You can get in touch with me for doubts on call or WhatsApp. You can always mail me your doubts at divineschoolofeconomics@gmail.com. This is where I stop in this online lesson.